Welcome everybody, my name is Carolyn Meyer. We are going to use the mics because we have our Middlebury Institute interpretation students in the booths up there in the back practicing their interpretation. So they're one of our 8th degree programs here. So thank you all for coming. My name again is Carolyn Meyer. I sit on the Committee for Art in Public Places. It's our new art committee at the Middlebury Institute. I'm also Director of Immersive Professional Learning in our Graduate School of International Policy and Business. And it's my pleasure to introduce our 3 speakers today. First of all, the photography, let's start with that. We have Oliver Klink, who is originally from Switzerland, had a career in the Bay Area in the tech field, and now is, and he was a physicist, worked in physics, and he's combined physics and photography to build a career in photography. So we're really happy that we have his 55 inches display of photos that we'll have a chance to tour in a bit after this presentation. And secondly, we're going to hear from Jennifer Koney, who's an abstract painter. She's also a climate activist with the Citizens Climate Lobby. And finally, we have Claudia McDonaugh, I'm never going to get my, McDonaugh. Claudia McDonaugh, she is a school teacher and has started one of the regional branches of the Citizens Climate Lobby. So we're excited to have her here today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Oliver to share a little bit about the history of this group, this motley crew of do-gooders, and a little bit about the paintings and the photography.
So thanks. So when we started the 55 inches, we started about 3 years ago in 2014. So Jennifer had scheduled an exhibit at the shoreline up in Hayward, and then a friend of ours basically connected us and he said, "Why don't you guys want to do an exhibit together?" So the idea was to basically use a painting and photography to deliver a message that was about what was happening with the water level rise. What was amazing is as soon as we started to look at our images, the color palette was working absolutely perfectly. And then there was even shape that I had photographed that Jennifer had painted. So the way Jennifer painted is she had basically 6 foot, right? It's about 6 foot doors. And then she has a line at 55 inches that shows basically what the water level rise would be. So that show started at shoreline, and then it got a lot of basically traction where it traveled. So it traveled in the Bay Area to 3-4 locations, and meanwhile, at about the same time, there were some election that were going on, and then there was a proposition that was actually happening there, and then with our basically influence, we thought that we influenced it maybe a little bit. Is that proposition got passed, and then some money got set aside to basically rebuild all the shorelines in the Bay Area. So that was actually really good. And I thought what the idea was, and we had a lot of kids that basically look at those exhibits, and then the families. It was all about inspiring them that if we do something right, is we could basically keep what today is like. Instead of always kind of pushing out, but try to remember what today is. So the slideshow that you see behind me is a travel that I've done in cold places. So I have traveled to Antarctica about 5 times. I've been to the Arctic twice. And then one of my most recent trip was Greenland, Eastern Greenland. And then what is interesting when I was in Eastern Greenland, in Iceland also, I can see a slideshow that was Iceland. In Eastern Greenland, I chartered a boat there, and I did ask the captain that had been sailing Eastern Greenland for many, many years, said, "Have you seen any changes?" And then to my big surprise, that as we know, right, as Greenland is changing there, right, we can see the ice cap, he said, "No, I didn't see any changes." And I was trying to dig a little deeper into why couldn't you see any changes. The guy is there so often that the small changes, he didn't remember all the small changes. The small changes were so tiny that from one trip to the other, he might have been affected, but he didn't really notice it. So that's, I think, what is difficult for me, right, when we talk about changes in the environment and when I photograph it, is how can you actually make sure that people understand of what's happening. There was one documentary that was made also about 4 years ago. It was called Chasing Ice. I'm not sure if you have seen that documentary. So there was James Baylog. James Baylog was a still photographer, and he decided at one point that he wanted to put cameras around glaciers and then use time-lapse. And then most of the people know about how a glacier recede right close to the ocean. But what was amazing in that documentary is suddenly glaciers were receding from the top, and suddenly you could see mountain behind it. And then for James Baylog, that really resisted like the longest he could, right, to do a documentary. He hired a guy from Stanford to do it. That actually put him on a map, and then he was able to basically do TED Talk. And now he's on to looking at pollution about the redwood trees. He places cameras on redwood trees. He's doing some project on the ozone layers. So if you're really strong, if you have a strong belief in what you do with photography, I do believe that it can lead to something really exceptional there. So, for you, Jennifer.
So I guess we need to switch the slides. Oh, thanks. So I'm Jennifer Koney. How do you do? Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Oliver for inviting us. And thank you for Middlebury Institute, Eduardo, Carolyn, and the Public Art crew to having us here. So I'm an artist, it's true, and I'm recently retired as a supervisor for Hayward Area Recreation and Park District. So I oversaw nature programs and was the representative for the district on a project that FEMA funded. That was a 3 to 4 year project called Adapting to Rising Tides. And the Adapting to Rising Tides project involved 36 agencies from the border of Union City to Emeryville to see what are the possible vulnerabilities and risks for the Hayward shoreline in particular regarding sea level rise. So as I was in essence an administrator, a bureaucrat, and a representative on this long-term study team, and then the reports started coming out. So I often say that it's not often you see a bureaucrat cry reading a report, but I was touched. I love the Hayward shoreline, and I started seeing what were the numbers, how much was inundation. And a matter of fact, it's these maps that did it for me. So, the places that I love, mid-century, being inundated, and knowing what it would mean to the wildlife, to the wetlands, to the people, and who was going to do something about it, and what does that mean? And that was just mid-century. Here's end of century. And this is based on the best science that they had at the time. So the 55 inches was, okay, so that's what triggered me. I have a deep love for the shoreline. I was shocked and awoken, and then I became compelled to act. And how did I act? The artist in me started making these paintings. These paintings, as Oliver said, on doors, the size of doors. And I would scratch a 55-inch line on these doors and do images. You'll see some of the images here. Claudia, do you mind just running through the first slide? That'd be great. Okay, so here's an image, for instance. So imagine that these are leaning against the wall, and when you stand in front of them, you're going to feel what 55 inches feels like, because that horizon line of where the glacier and where the carbon footprints in the melting ice are, that's 55 inches, so you can have a physical experience. The subtext, and there are 7 of these paintings, so it creates an installation. And they all have that 55-inch line, because at the time that was what was expected for the Hayward shoreline, and I wanted to make the abstract real. So our subtext was abstraction meets reality, which is Jennifer abstraction paintings meets Oliver's beautiful, articulate, short lens photography. And we had this remarkable parallel going on, even though we didn't know it. And as a viewer, to have a direct experience of what would the impacts be like, so trying to engage you. So that's where this started. And you'll notice, some of the imagery has, glaciers, icebergs. This one in particular has a canary in one of the icebergs, because ice is a canary in the coal mine, so to speak. So I fell deeply in love also with ice as part of this project. And in addition to creating paintings, I created educational programs. And we took this on tour. So we've reached out to now 550 people at least around the Bay Area. This place we had like 6 different shows, and it would always be alongside what Sharks in My Backyard workshop that would educate people as to what are the current reports. So this is a continuation of that as a way of backdoor education, because I realize that we have to deal with this issue before and beyond the fear, so that we can take action, because there's no time to be paralyzed for this. And I welcome Claudia here to talk about what action steps we can take. So part of this, so I also became a climate activist. In addition to doing the arts and creating educational programs, I now am doing climate activism. And so this is my story of inspired action, and I'm hoping it inspires you as well. Yeah, let's move to the next one. Oh, it should work by just clicking. Okay, great. So we have the backdoor approach. Oh, so something interesting. You'll see some of the quotes that inspired me as I was making the paintings. It was a year-long process of making these paintings, and it's using a process. I have an example of one of my small-scale paintings here of a resist and pour process. It's kind of interesting. I have a textile background, but I'm also a painter, and I experiment with all sorts of materials. So I painted an image of glaciers. I used wax to protect it and silver leaf to protect those images and do details, and then I'd inundate the painting with more paint. And then I'd wait till it dried, scrubbed it off, and see what was left. So the process that I used, roughly, in painting this is an inundation process to describe inundation itself. So there's some interesting things. I think art has a backdoor way of reaching you if and when you're ready to hear the information. If you're not ready, you're not going to see it. But if you are, then you'll start asking, why is that? And we used that. And so we got involved with the Measure AA campaign, which was a 9-county initiative on the 2016 ballot to $12 per household tax in order to restore wetlands around the bay so that it would help protect against inundation, storm flooding, and the impacts of sea level rise. And it passed by 70%. In a 9-county area, and it had never been done before. And so just last Wednesday, and I've got articles here, that they just allocated the first $18 million towards wetland restoration as a way of protecting against sea level rise. So inspired action really does, sometimes work. So there we go. So rapid change. What you're seeing here are the current estimates based on the state of California's most recent report called Sea Level Rise Guidance that just came out in March 2018. And I put it with the Monterey and San Francisco Bay so you can see the ranges. And I'm going to use Claudia. And this is where I'm going to go get the educator in me is going to get a little interactive, okay? So I always like to be physical on these things. So Claudia is going to be my person. What is 13.2 inches? And what can we expect by 2050? Let's do that one. Okay, so 13.2. So I won't put tape on you on this one. And then 22.8. I'm going to use your pant leg, Claudia. 22.8, right about here. Okay. So the range could be anywhere from here to here by 2050. Okay. Now, when we get to 2100, by the end of the century, let's look at 27.6, Claudia. So somewhere right about here. Okay, so this would be the minimum of additional sea level rise that we're talking. And then Claudia, the pièce de résistance is what actually is 82.8 inches that they're describing in this report. And funny thing, it just happens to be the height of the flagpoles. Okay? Okay, you're good. I think we get the visuals. So there's a range. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, there is a caveat here. Greenland, the Greenland sheet of ice that's on land right now, should it melt completely, would add another 20 feet. Now, nobody's adding this into this yet because it's just, they don't have enough certainty for that. So let's just go on. So there you go.
Could you just tell us why such a range? Why is it 13.2 to 22.8?
Thank you, Carolyn. Why is there a range? Because carbon emissions, we don't know. What are we going to do? People. How much can people stop with carbon emissions and how quickly? how quickly can we peak? And that's why there's this range of scenarios. So every time you see these longer range reports, they already predicted we can't do too much to change by 2050. But if we can peak before 2050, that's going to significantly change what happens in 2100. So actions we take now are going to have big impacts for the long run. So let's go to the next one. So, yeah, what does that really mean? 108 million people live on the coasts of this world, so 3 feet or more. So let's go to the next one. Now, there is hope. People are working on this. We are working on this. Mark Jacobson, the professor from Stanford, and 26 of his colleagues, has outlined in the past 100% renewable by 2050, a plan to do so for California. And his most recent report, which came out in, was it February or March, I think it was? Now they've identified how to get 139 countries to be 100% renewable energy by 2050 with existing technologies. So there are plans out there. And why 139 countries? Because they're responsible for 99% of global carbon emissions. So there's something really positive on that. So the Paris Agreement is based on keeping it below 2 degrees centigrade, and it would require substantial emissions reductions by the next few decades. So think 2030, 2050. How do we do that? How do we get to near zero? And they're saying, so by the end of the century. I would be a little bit more aggressive than that. So Claudia will talk a little bit more, has more information about this concept of drawdown, which means that we peak carbon emissions by 2030, 2040, 2050, and then actually start sequestering carbon to making it even better. So there are things of hope that we can do this better and figure out how to not only just peak and stop, but actually to sequester. There are solutions to climate change on a global scale. So let's see. And let me just bring you back up to hope, please. So that Measure AA was approved by 70% of the voters, and it was the first 9-county initiative to do so. People voted to do this. The funding was always the tricky part, and now we've got $18 million that are being used right now to restore the wetlands in order to adapt and prevent some of the sea level rise. So this is an interesting report from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Change, and they say that 5 years of not acting, let's say if you don't do anything, will result in 8 more inches by 2300. So now is the time for inspired action. So I'm going to pass the mic on to Claudia, and Claudia's going to talk about how we're currently involved with Citizens Climate Lobby, and at the federal level, there is a proposed legislation to put a fee on carbon that goes back to households in order to effectively reduce carbon emissions. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, as was mentioned earlier, I'm a 5th grade teacher. I'm an elementary school teacher, and I got involved with Citizens Climate Lobby as a volunteer activist back in 2014. I rode the climate train from Berkeley to New York City for the almost 500,000 person march along Central Park. And on the climate train, we didn't just write songs and play songs and hold workshops and admire the gorgeous views of Colorado and everything from across the country, but we also, as I say, educated each other, and I learned about Citizens Climate Lobby. And it sounded to me, from everything I could gather immediately, as a really logical way to be involved in helping to solve the problem of climate change. And so I joined the Berkeley chapter for a year and went to their monthly meetings, and we wrote letters to the editor, of which hundreds and hundreds have been published across the country. We meet with legislators on a regular basis. There's a banner down here of my husband and me and 1,000 other people in Washington, D.C. For our summer lobby drive, where we lobby in Washington, D.C., but mostly we lobby in district twice a year and get as many of our legislators as possible on board with putting a price on carbon pollution. There's a very well-researched and mapped out way of doing this. It's endorsed by, on a bipartisan basis. by both sides of the aisle because it's market-based, revenue neutral. The fee will be returned to households, much as people in Alaska get a benefit, a financial benefit for living in Alaska, according to the Regional Economic Modeling, Inc., a very well-established and well-respected group that models for corporations as well as countries, as well as, as for us. They modeled the effects of a price on carbon. And starting at $10 per ton, something that's happening in several countries already, and steadily increasing year by year so that coal and oil and gas companies all need to pay for every ton they extract and pay for some of the damage that their products will cause. This would quickly, in a very predictable and not destabilizing to the economy manner, bring carbon pollution down by half within 20 years. It would create 2 or 3 million new jobs because the dividend in people's pockets would be spent to stimulate the economy, and no business would be harmed in the process as we shift quickly to renewable energy. Of course, the benefits are many, and the thing that's missing is political will, because it still doesn't fall high enough on people's list of priorities to deal with climate change. And so just like Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama were able to raise equivalent of huge donors with small donations, Citizen Climate Lobby banks on being able to motivate political will in small chapter meetings that meet monthly across the country. We have 450 chapters or so. There's one in Monterey. There's internationally also. There's a sign-up sheet outside there if you want to be on the mailing list. We have a weekly introductory phone call. We have lots and lots of support. The website is amazing with resources and information. And monthly we practice explaining carbon fee and dividend to people. We do tabling at farmers markets, any kind of activism that appeals to you. I work with my students. The California PTA encourages educators to teach climate change problems and solutions so my students learn. And we're going to be lobbying our local school board to write a resolution urging our federal government to put a price on carbon pollution. So there's so many ways to be involved in solving this problem that there are many, many reasons to hope. So I urge you to go to our website, citizensclimatelobby.org, and see what you can get there that interests you. And if you would like to be a supporter, it's free to join. And when we have enough supporters, we will pass this legislation and we will start to reverse climate change.
Thanks, Claudia. So that's the federal level. And then at the state level, I'm working with 350bayarea.org, and where there's a real push. And I've got postcards out there. And if you're interested in doing something that's effective action, it would be to get your state legislator, let them know that you're interested in letting California go 100% renewable energy by 2045. So it's right now SB 100, it's hung up in committee, and it's just asking that we move towards 100% renewable energy for electricity generation by 2045. And there's postcards. If you would take as many as you're willing to send or give to your state legislator in the next couple weeks, please do so, because they need to hear that Californians want clean, green energy. They say they're not hearing anything from their constituents. It's stuck in committee right now, and they want to hear political will. So on the state front, if you want to help do effective action regarding this, help push towards clean, green energy for California by turning in some postcards. And lastly, before I hand it over for questions and any other follow-up comments, I'd like to bring it back to the bold and inspired action. I always come back to the heart. The heart is what was hurt, the heart is what opened, and the heart is what compels me to bring this information and help inspire others to take action, because our window of action is now, and I believe that we can make a difference. We can be the generation that turns this around and reimagines a better way. I think it's possible, and now's the time to do so. And in remembering the lesson of the water that we're taking these images of, the lessons of water is that it's agile, that it's persistent, and it overcomes barriers, no matter how strong and sturdy those barriers may seem. Just keep on moving on. So the lessons of water to give us heart as we move forward with taking effective action. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to. All right, so now we're going to have a few questions that I prepared for the group, but then we're going to open up to the panel. Open up to the audience for you to have your chance to ask any questions you'd like. So first of all, I wanted to bring it back to art momentarily. How do you, Oliver and Claudia and Jennifer and Claudia, how would you consider art, or how would you like to see art used as a tool to mitigate climate change as far as activism is concerned? Where is it best used? How have you seen it best used? Where would you like it to see it go and be used in the future moving forward?
So for me, I believe the images just speak for themselves. If you show, like for example, you can see some of the image there. This one was taken in 2011 in Iceland. And when people saw that image, it triggered the desire to actually go and basically travel to that place. One day, most people, when they got there about 5 years, 6 years later, that beach that is really famous for all those icebergs, they pretty much had disappeared. So they were really tiny little icebergs. So they come back and they said, what happened in between? So I think people have to realize that there are changes. And then if they visually see those changes when they come back, they're more likely to take action. So like for example, for me, right, is when I come back, I know that water is really, really precious. When I travel around the world, it's probably one thing that we're going to run out the first. And then if we really run out of water, is basically drinking water, then everything is going to be really bad in terms of the human population is going to decrease. Is going to be unbearable to live at all those different places. Also, what I learned in terms of showing those images across the Bay Area is our kids really want to see what is there. Most of the time when I show images of animals, they said, "Oh, I want to go and see those animals," and then I'm trying to entice them that those animals don't live on the TV. Those animals really live in the wild, and then just get them to Moss Landing or get them here in the Bay Area and see the sea otters. I think that's really important.
I agree completely, and I also like to add about how art has a very a subtle and compelling power of capturing your heart. And if action is going to be taken and being sustainable, I think it has to open up that channel of being compelled to do something over the long run, over the long haul, with persistence, barriers, and almost impossible visions of what could be. So that in order to be inspired and fueled and persistent, you've got to be fed by whatever that vision is. And I think artists in particular help paint the vision of what the future can be. So there's some power that is very subtle power of art, but it's what we need now. And we need inspired thinking. We need innovators. And how else to innovate? And art plays a big role in that, I'd say.
And we have a class on behavior change strategies we use for the environmental policy program here to try to look at how humans work, and manipulation for good, I call it, but it is trying to look at human nature. And one of the things I noticed in this class, and then I saw in action, was we had a group of Chinese students funded by Packard to come to Monterey and look at how our ecosystem has rebounded. This ecosystem back here was, as some of you may know, had faced overfishing and many issues with our environment here that we've cleaned up. And they wanted to learn about sustainability and fishing and preserve the fishing industry in China, because they're coming up against overfishing. But they all mentioned this attachment to animals, like you said. Oh, we don't want to see the animals die. And just it's human. If you go back to those triggers for people, you can motivate them. So it's interesting to hear that. I wanted to know, this is a bigger question. What are some of the solutions that have been effective in motivating people or promoting action against climate change, negative climate change?
I would say, getting back to education, that the California PTA has urged teachers to teach the problem and especially solutions to climate change, to empower the younger generation to know that it's not it's not unsolvable. It's very solvable. And so I think there's a huge deficit of hope. And so it's empowerment, it's political will, it's people finding a way to plug in with their skills, interests, passions, and the things they enjoy doing that connect them in community with logical actions that promote awareness and people being part of the process of decision making. So yeah, generating the political will is a big part of moving us forward.
Any other big solutions? This is a big problem, but you have experience, Jennifer, at the government level.
Yeah,
Anything you can do locally?
Well, it started, I guess, with the studies, and there were people of vision who knew that we needed more information, and they were in positions of power. So they generated studies to get information, and then leverage that information to get a bigger awareness, and then leverage that for even bigger awareness. And then ultimately, so I'm thinking about Bill Quirks, who's now an assembly member, was on our Hayward area shoreline planning team. And he was just a member of this 6-member body. And he said, we need to see what the possible impacts are. So they pitched in $10,000 for each of the agencies, did this study. And that study is what intrigued FEMA into selecting the Hayward shoreline as their test site, which then involved these 36 agencies over 3 years, getting all this more information. That information was used to generate Measure AA, which then said, well, if we've got this much vulnerabilities we have to address, where's the funding going to come from? So then it became political will because there was a solution. We could put a tax, and this $12 per year tax could be used to restore wetlands because it's cheaper to do the prevention than it is to do the repair. So let's propose a solution to the citizenry. And by that time, the education campaign had caught up so that people were aware of it. And we didn't use fear. We used love your wildlife, increase habitat and access, improve livability. So focusing on the benefits, people passed it. And now we're starting to do this exactly what we proposed to do. So focusing on the positive and understanding takes time. It takes a lot of different layers working, and at some point it coalesces and you have some effective action.
And of course, it also takes cooperation on both sides of the aisle politically, and that's been a major strength, I think, of Citizens Climate Lobby, is that our proposed solution is very much a bipartisan, nonpartisan kind of a solution. And we've had great success in inspiring the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus into existence, which after our recent November election has skyrocketed from just a few members, half Republicans and half Democrats, and there are many Democrats on the waiting list to get onto this committee, but they can't join until they have a Republican partner to keep it balanced, to keep it bipartisan. And it's now up to 35 Republicans and 35 Democrats, and they have already introduced several pieces of legislation to either cap carbon emissions, to put in a revenue neutral fee on carbon pollution, and the more support they have, the more quickly they can move bills through Congress that would have teeth in them and that would put a national price on carbon pollution in order to speed the transition to renewables.
Thank you. One of our professors, Sandra Dow, teaches a class on environmental, social, and governmental risk, ESG. She's a finance professor, and KPMG has been looking at environmental risks as a threat for decades, but it's become more prominent. How is your organization working with the corporate environment, and could they be another avenue?
Oh, most definitely.
Business,
yes. So grassroots is how it started, with, like I said, chapters like the one that meets at my house every month and 450 other houses around the country every month. But there's there are lots of subcommittees or action teams within Citizens Climate Lobby, and one of them is business climate leaders. And that group I've worked with also, where they're establishing relationships with the largest corporations and down to small corporations, but really working with business so that business can see the advantages to a livable climate and how policies that they support can help them in the long run and in the short run with job creation, money in people's pockets to pay for, the stimulating the economy through the recycling of the revenue. And it is important to work with businesses. You're very much correct, and Citizens Climate Lobby is doing that also.
in getting to the local level with Measure AA and its passage. When you look at this map of inundation by 2100, if you just go a little bit further south, there's Facebook, there's Google, there's Apple. So who do you think was supporting Measure AA? They were. So we definitely use them. And then I also wanted to mention at the federal level with the carbon fee and dividend, oil companies in their long-range projections, because that's what they do, they plan for the long haul, have already factored in a carbon fee being added. So it's just we're catching up to what they're already projecting and planning for, because they'd rather know in advance than have it be erratic. So it's like businesses are fully aware, and we are on the same side in many ways. So we can certainly use that.
Okay, one last question. Thanks. We train students here to be social change agents, and one of the things I've noticed is some of my students working for me have said we don't have enough skills to be activists. We don't know where to start. You know, we think of their generation as this generation of the Obama generation. Oh, they all gave money. They were all signing these online forms, but they don't still feel like they can actually make change in a more concrete way, other than filling something out online. So what recommendations, or what skills do they need, and what recommendations for this as an educational institution might you make in developing these future current leaders?
Okay, so I'll dive in. I've learned everything I know about lobbying from Citizens Climate Lobby. They have an online education, CCL University. So, if you don't know how to do it, they'll teach you. Like even from everything from tabling, how's the most effective way of doing that, to the regional conference or the annual conference where you're talking to real people who are working with legislators or the legislators themselves, and you're learning, how do you be a good lobbyist? How do you, and what's the most effective way? So we focus a lot on letters to the editor, because you get a lot of mileage on that. So they have workshops online, how to write a good letter to the editor. And then the weekly calls that are on Saturday mornings, or recorded podcasts, they'll have an expert come talk to you for an hour about how the military is planning for climate change. And you learn so much, and there's resources out there. And I'd say Citizens Climate Lobby has just such a great pool of education, because it takes so much more than just a bill. It takes like everybody getting involved and understanding. So I'm just touting the praises of the training and the education from, in this particular case, Citizens Climate Lobby.
A lot of legislators have commented to us also that we've managed to change the tone of the discussion in Washington, D.C. from a very toxic and divisive tone to much more of a problem-solving tone, because we always enter with respect, appreciation, and solution focus. And I think that can work in any arena of life.
So I have actually another example that I got invited to talk at Stanford to the graduating MBA class, and then they wanted me to talk about Antarctica, what it was like to be there. And the reason for it, because they had a trip that they had scheduled to go to Antarctica. And then their idea was to invite basically leaders from various businesses to come with them and explain basically what they were doing in their business, and then how they could basically contribute to that global warming. So I thought for the students, what was really interesting is they really went and brought those leaders directly to the place where is basically we see the changes there. And then I never followed up with them on how the trip was, but I think it was probably really effective to get basically the younger generation that goes into leadership, talking to the actual leaders and how things can change. So for the younger generation, that could be exactly the same here, right? The graduating class basically plan a trip that is really important to them, the issues that they want to do, invite leaders, and then even it doesn't have to be really that far, right? You can just go to Moss Landing, take a little boat down Moss Landing, and then those people start to talk about this is really critical to us, right? Is how can we preserve this, and how can we make an effect on preservation when we become the new leaders in companies?
Really make it real that way.
Totally.
I'm going to go out in the audience. Anybody have a question? I guess you can shout it out, but because of the interpretation, we'll use the mic. You got it.
So I have a question about your postcard. You're shooting for 2045. Is that what you,
2045 to
do
be
we have
100%.
that much
Oh, let me tell
time?
you. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. So each step forward is a step forward, right? There's not going to be one silver bullet. And let me just thank you for that question, because right now we had our standards by 2020 were to be 35% renewable by 2020, and we're going to hit 50% renewable by 2020. So we're about 10 years ahead of our stringent standards in California already. So we just want to amp up the bar even more and then claim it as 100% renewable by 2045.
But 2045 sounds so far away. That's all I'm saying. It sounds like it's forever. I mean, I'm like, let's do it now, tomorrow, next year.
Thank you.
And I just want to point out that obviously political action is where we have to be right now. We've got Pruitt in there, and we've got to get
Absolutely.
I mean, just say it right out here.
Yeah, and he's trying to, I've got an article here, change our California car
Whoever's listening
standards.
to me,
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, exactly. Well, okay, and in response to that, I just want to remind you that California is the 6th largest economy in the world, and we are the leaders in the United States, and we have a lot of power of example. And not only do we have the strongest environmental standards in California, we are a growing and a thriving economy. So if we can do both of those, we can show others that this is possible, and why not like ratchet up the bar even more and show that we could be good for the planet as well as good for the people.
It just feels like to me that we've got 5 or 10 years to make serious changes. 2045 to me just is it's just way too far.
Well, okay, and then let's take it to our standards right now. We're exceeding it. So if you set that bar and you just get us on the train, and then people could do even better than we have so far. I'm optimistic just because I believe that people, once we get some momentum, will have a lot more power to be able to achieve this.
I watch too much of the news.
Try the Solutions Project. Mark Jacobson, Stanford University website's really neat the way they've mapped out how quickly every country by 2050, but that doesn't mean starting in 2050, that means finishing in 2050, with being 100% renewable, because every country in the world has the availability of wind or solar or hydro or geothermal or tidal turbines or whatever, and they map it out so that a 5th grader can understand it very easily, that every country is going to have a different mix, and it's not going to take very much land space, and it's with existing technologies it's doable. With what's coming around next year, it's going to be doable faster.
Amen.
So I think also I was in India. I've traveled to India quite a fair amount in the last 2 years, and they are doing something also to just do renewable energy. And then for them, the biggest challenge is garbage that they have, and garbage is going to turn into renewable energy. And they are really saying, that same article, that if we look at all the industrialized country, is by that 2025 is going to be 80% of the world that could be actually powered by renewable energy. And then the reason they don't do 100%, because the other countries, it would cost too much money to basically build the infrastructure to have renewable energy there. So some positive that's happening around the world too.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention there was a program on the NPR where there is a city in Texas that's already 100% renewable, and he's Republican. And he was also an economist, so he was saying how practical it was going to save the citizens money and all this sort of thing. So that was really encouraging. But my question is, you've talked about Hayward, but we haven't really talked about what the city of Monterey is doing. So does anybody know, and how do we put pressure on our city to be more renewable on a very local level?
So I need to ask, for those of you who are in Monterey, are you aware of a community choice aggregate being formed for Monterey? I believe that you are part of community choice aggregates are like Marin Community Energy is one, where the local agencies control the source of the energy. So you use PG&E as the vehicle to transport it and the billing mechanism, but it's up to these agencies to decide where they get their power from and how much of what kind of power. So Alameda County is in the process of initiating their community choice aggregate. It's called East Bay Community Energy, and it's we have the choice of, as individuals and businesses, of getting 100% renewable energy electric generation by this, and you have to opt out not to be part of it. So everybody will automatically be part of this, and we're just ramping up into it starting in June. So and I know that this community choice aggregates or community choice energy is happening all around the state. And I believe from what I'm remembering from my recent phone calls from last month is that Monterey is also in that process. So if I were in Monterey, I would be asking the questions, are we considering becoming part of a community choice aggregate? Or community choice energy, and if not, then ask for that to happen, because that gives you the businesses and individuals options to be 100% renewable electric energy.
Arcadia Power also offers that option of being either partially or totally wind powered, so that you pay a little bit more in order to have your PG&E.
Is that
be
anywhere
renewable.
in the state?
I believe so. You've heard of it? Arcadia Power? Yeah, you can do that here.
Yeah, the city in Texas was talking about that, and they own their own energy system, so it's a lot easier for them to switch over, whereas with PG&E, it's a little bit more complicated because of the generation and so forth. But he said it was all doable.
Yeah, and it's happening all across the state. I can't say for sure what the number is, but I'm guessing in the 20s, a number of aggregates that are being formed. Now, there's been, by the CPUC, California level, they're trying to put a hold on them. So there is a blocking and so we're constantly fighting that battle. And they recently succeeded in putting a pause on the development of them, but there's a loophole. That's a workaround that people can still work with. It's just an application saying to get around it, because there's so many being formed, they don't know how to handle it all at the same time. So there's some pushback, but we still are moving forward.
So in Canada, you have also, I think it's in Nova Scotia, they're trying to do fully renewable energy. It's going to be based on solar and wind, and then stored in batteries. And then if that model basically works, it's a 5-year project, then it's going to be installed in every cities in Canada. So that's basically what they're doing. And then they're working with Tesla. So that's Tesla. Now, as you know, also Puerto Rico, when they they were lacking all this power, just Tesla came in and then basically gave all the batteries to, because when you talk about renewable energy is how do you actually store that energy? And I think that's the biggest issue that a lot of people have right now. Because we could have old solars in our roof, right? Renewable energy, but how do you actually store that power there?
Seems like the technology, we have a lot of the technology if we don't have all of the technology. So this seems to me to be a political problem.
Exactly.
In terms of generation and storage and distribution, I think we all know how to do that. It's just that until there's political will, until people are marching and the people are, in place in our government to push this forward, they can do so much damage. I mean, that's my view.
Grab them by the midterms.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge on technology there, most of the technology comes from foreign countries now. So Australia is really big on renewable energy, how to store renewable energy. And then the thing is, again, right, with import-export basically tariffs that are basically set, is the US has to come a little more basically avant-garde in terms of creating this renewable energy.
Go Tesla.
As an example.
Well, I want to just thank all of our panelists and our guests and invite you upstairs. We have a small reception with coffee and a few desserts, I think, and then we'll be able to walk through the exhibit. It's just upstairs. You can go up this way, right up above us, and you can see Oliver's work and talk with him, and our guests will be here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.